Watch how a heated Commons exchange turns into a brutal clash over channel crossings, refugees and Britain's immigration policy. Jeremy Corbyn raises the global humanitarian crisis, but Philp fires back with a direct challenge over who is actually making these dangerous crossings and why. Before we continue, hit like and subscribe to Britain Daily for more explosive political coverage. Let's watch this explosive clip.
Those illegal immigrants, and they are illegal immigrants, are leaving a safe country, France. They're not fleeing danger, they're in France already. So I do agree, it creates a massive pull factor, yes.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Has he considered for a moment why there are so many refugees globally? Why there are 70 million people without a home to call their own? What the effects of wars, environmental disaster and human rights abuse has on populations around the world? Shouldn't there be an international effort to try to help those people as well as dealing with the problems at home? Will putting up barbed wire all around the world solve the problem or create an even worse situation globally?
What I don't think will solve the problem is transferring potentially tens of millions of people. He gave the number just then, it was 60 or 70 million. Transferring tens of millions of people into the West, I don't think is the right solution to this problem. Those people who are displaced are probably better helped close to their country of origin. But transporting people en masse into this country, I don't think is the solution to that. And by the way, the people who are crossing by small boat are not the most vulnerable. They're not typically women and children. They're not people who are sick and vulnerable. They are mostly young men who are paying people smugglers. And if we were going to choose who to help, it wouldn't be mainly young men who are paying people smugglers. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to just make a little bit of progress. I will give way again, but I want to make a bit of progress. There'll be plenty of other opportunities.
That exchange may have lasted only a few moments, but it opens up one of the biggest and most emotionally charged questions in British politics. What should Britain actually do when people arrive on its shores after crossing the English Channel in small boats? And this is where the argument becomes much bigger than one political disagreement. Jeremy Corbyn's intervention focused on the wider humanitarian picture. His question was essentially this: if tens of millions of people around the world are displaced by war, persecution, environmental disasters and human rights abuses, can Britain really solve the problem simply by putting up stronger barriers? That is a serious question. Because behind every statistic is a human being. People who leave their homes are not simply numbers on a government spreadsheet. Some have experienced conflict. Some have lived through persecution, some have spent years in unstable countries, and some genuinely believe that taking an enormous risk is their only remaining option. That human dimension cannot simply be ignored, but Philp's response went directly to another concern, and this is where the political temperature rises. His argument was that Britain cannot respond to a global displacement crisis by accepting potentially enormous numbers of people into the country. Instead, he argued that vulnerable people should be helped closer to their countries of origin, and that the channel crossings are being driven, at least in part, by the incentives created by the current system. And then came the line that really changed the tone of the exchange. Philp challenged the idea that the people crossing the channel in small boats are predominantly women and children in extreme vulnerability. He argued that many of those making the journey are young men paying people smugglers. Whether you agree with his conclusion or not, this is an important distinction in the political debate, because there are actually two separate questions here. The first is, how should Britain treat vulnerable people seeking protection? The second is, how should Britain respond to an organised and dangerous system of people smuggling across the Channel? Those questions can overlap, but they are not necessarily the same thing. And this is exactly why immigration debates become so explosive. One side warns that a hardline approach risks abandoning people who genuinely need protection. The other side warns that an uncontrolled system can undermine public confidence, place pressure on housing and public services, and encourage criminal smuggling networks to profit from desperate people. For ordinary people watching this debate, the frustration is obvious. They want a system that is both compassionate and controlled. They want genuine refugees to have somewhere safe to turn. But they also want to know that the government has control over who enters the country, how applications are processed, and what happens when claims are rejected. And that is perhaps the uncomfortable middle ground that politicians often struggle to explain, because slogans are easy. Stop the boats, open the borders, help refugees, protect Britain. All of those phrases can generate applause from different parts of the political spectrum, but governing is much harder. Governments have to deal with the practical reality. What happens to people when they arrive? How quickly are asylum claims processed? What happens when someone is granted protection? What happens when a claim is refused? How do authorities tackle people smuggling gangs? And how can Britain work with France and other countries to reduce dangerous crossings without simply moving the problem somewhere else? These are difficult questions. And that is why this Commons exchange is worth paying attention to. Corbyn was asking MPs to look beyond Britain's borders and consider the enormous scale of global displacement. Philp was asking MPs to focus on the practical consequences of large-scale irregular migration and the incentives created by the current system. Both arguments tap into powerful emotions. One appeals to compassion, the other appeals to security, control and fairness, and millions of people across Britain are probably somewhere between those two positions. They may believe that Britain should help people fleeing genuine persecution, but they may also believe that immigration rules must mean something. They may sympathise with people risking their lives at sea, but still believe that criminal gangs should not be allowed to decide who reaches Britain. They may want Britain to be generous, but also want politicians to acknowledge the limits of public resources, and that is where the debate becomes personal. Because immigration isn't an abstract political issue for many people, it affects communities, it affects local services, it affects housing, it affects taxpayers. It affects Britain's relationship with France and other European countries, and above all, it affects public trust. If people believe the system is fair, they are more likely to support humanitarian policies. But if they believe the rules are being ignored or manipulated, public support can disappear very quickly. That is the political danger for any government, and it explains why the Channel crossings have become such a powerful symbol in British politics. For some voters, the boats represent a failure of border control. For others, they represent a humanitarian emergency. For others still, they represent both at the same time. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from this exchange. Britain doesn't have to choose between compassion and borders. The real challenge is finding a system capable of delivering both. A country can have controlled borders while still recognising genuine refugees. It can tackle criminal smugglers without treating every person seeking protection as a criminal. It can help displaced people internationally while also maintaining a functioning domestic asylum system. But achieving that requires more than dramatic speeches. It requires policies that actually work. It requires international cooperation. It requires faster decision-making. It requires enforcement where claims are rejected. And it requires political leaders to be honest with the public about what Britain can and cannot do. That is why moments like this in Parliament matter. Because when politicians clash over immigration, they are not simply arguing about statistics. They are arguing about what kind of country Britain wants to be. A country defined primarily by humanitarian responsibility, a country defined primarily by strong borders, or a country attempting to balance both. That is the question viewers are ultimately left with after watching this exchange. And perhaps the most revealing part is that there is no simple answer. Corbyn's intervention reminds us that behind the statistics are people facing circumstances that can be devastating. Philp's response reminds us that governments still have to maintain control of their borders and confront the criminal networks exploiting vulnerable people. Both realities exist at the same time. The real test for Britain's politicians is whether they can acknowledge that complexity instead of reducing the entire debate to slogans. Because the British public deserves more than political theatre. They deserve answers. They deserve a system that is humane, credible and properly enforced. And they deserve to know who is ultimately responsible when that system fails. So what do you think? Was Jeremy Corbyn right to focus on the wider humanitarian crisis? Or did Chris Philp make the stronger argument by focusing on the channel crossings, people smuggling networks, and Britain's ability to control its borders? And most importantly, can Britain protect vulnerable refugees while also stopping dangerous illegal crossings? Let us know what you think in the comments. Keep the debate respectful, but don't be afraid to say exactly what you believe. If you found this analysis interesting, hit like, subscribe to Britain Daily, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next breakdown of the biggest political clashes in Westminster. Thanks for watching Britain Daily, and we'll see you in the next one.